Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Thomas Maddox. I'm the Director for Nature at CDP, which is one of the largest environmental disclosure platform for corporates in the world. And I'm delighted to be here with you today to be chatting with Matthias Jungblut about the new EU deforestation regulation that is coming in very shortly. Now, as you can hear from my voice, I'm struggling a little bit, so I'm going to let Matthias do most of the talking. But before we kick off, Matthias, I just wanted to say a couple of words of context about why we're talking about this particular regulation and why we're talking about forests. So over the last couple of days, you'll have heard lots about many different environmental issues. Why is deforestation a particularly important one? And I think there's two reasons I'd argue that it's important. The first one is that forests themselves are an incredibly important part of our environment. So they're incredibly important in terms of the climate challenge. So forests are a sink for carbon of about 25 gigatons a year, a net sink. Destruction of forests is driving about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. So they're a really important part of the climate story, and we're not going to meet our climate targets unless we're also addressing deforestation. But the other important thing about deforestation, I think, is it's almost an unnecessary impact. So deforestation is driven primarily by the conversion of forest land to agricultural land. So it's about the production of commodities such as timber, obviously, but also palm oil, soy, cattle-derived products, coffee, cocoa, rubber. But none of these commodities need deforestation to produce them. Deforestation happens because we don't have the right incentives and disincentives to stop it. So the EU deforestation regulation is one of the actions to try and address that. And it's not before time. So at CDP, we've been tracking progress on deforestation for about 10 years. We have about 1,000 companies disclosing to us at the moment, and the results don't look good. It's only about 10% of the companies that choose to disclose to us could argue that they are close or near to achieving deforestation from their supply chains. And that's not good enough. That's not fast enough. It's improving each year, but it needs to be improving much, much quicker. So let's talk about how the EU deforestation regulation may improve that situation. Matthias, can I start by asking you to give us a quick introduction to who you are and who you represent?
Sure. So hello, everyone. My name is Matthias Jungblut. I'm responsible at osapiens for our product development. What do we do at osapiens? We are providing software solutions to companies to help to comply with ESG regulations and automate those tasks as much as possible. And within that regards, the EUDR, the European Deforestation-Free regulation, is definitely one of the most challenging ones we've been working on right now, and happy to give you some insights into that today.
Excellent. Okay. Excuse me. So, as I understand it, one of the first requirements of the EU deforestation regulation is going to be for companies to be collecting a huge amount of data. They're going to be collecting a huge amount of data on their supply chains, where their products are coming from. And then on top of that, they're going to have to start looking at the risks that come from that and what actions are they going to be taking to mitigate those risks. So can you talk a little bit about how companies might be able to approach that and how your system may be able to assist with that?
Sure, definitely. So I think mainly companies have the challenge that they need to have a look at how they are impacted by the European deforestation regulation. We talk about 30,000 companies in Europe that are impacted by the regulation. So it's quite a large number of companies that are impacted. And first of all, they don't know where to start. That's usually what we see with the companies we talk to. And the first step usually is doing an impact assessment to really see, okay, which products that I'm selling or that I'm manufacturing are impacted by the regulation. And then on the other side, it's a lot of different pieces and puzzles that you need to bring together, because on one hand side, we have the traceability and data gathering that you need to ensure upstream the supply chain. So you need to collect a huge amount of data from your producers or from your suppliers, especially outside of Europe, is where the main challenges remain. And everyone usually, when we talk about deforestation, thinks, okay, it's just collecting geolocation data from the producers and then checking the deforestation status of them. But it's much more than that, because additionally to the geolocation data, also the production date and production period needs to be transmitted and collected, and it makes it a heavy transactional system. So when you have collected that data, you first of all need to do risk assessment. You have reporting obligations. You need to submit a due diligence statement. And then also challenging, you need to pass that data on downstream to the supply chain, because the next European operator or the next European retailer, they also have reporting and due diligence requirements that they need to comply with. So it's a lot of different puzzles and a lot of processes within companies that are touched that they need to bring together, and automating that as much as possible, especially the data gathering, reporting, and passing on the data with software is kind of inevitable in a way.
And I think it's right that many of these supply chains for those forest risk commodities we mentioned before, they're particularly complicated supply chains, aren't they? And they're particularly complicated by the fact that many of them rely on a lot of smallholders. Can you talk a little bit about how that might bring extra challenges to companies wanting to report on this?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, it's obvious when you have smallholders within the supply chain, is a lot of producers. So it's not just a couple of big producers, it's a lot of small producers from which you need to gather the data, and the supply chains are quite complex. Usually you don't know the producer, you know the exporter in the country of production. And then there's certain different companies in between. And somehow you need to get to the data from the producer, which is definitely a challenge, especially in markets which are smallholder dominated, and the smallholders don't rely on European export. There it's even more challenges. If there's a large amount of European export in those smallholders, it's getting easier to convince them, at least, because there is the challenge that you need to engage with them. So there's nothing that software can help in providing them with traceability solutions. That's why we basically published our traceability solution as a freemium for all of those impacted smallholders. But on the other side, it's also engaging with them. Someone needs to explain them the requirements, and it's not just the traceability. We have the legality aspect, and the legality aspect also impacts a lot the smallholders, because in a lot of cases, they don't have the required documents and so on, and it's a challenge for them to collect them. So it's very important to engage with them as early as possible to look at that, and not having them excluded from the supply chain in terms of EUDR.
Are there any particular sectors that you think are going to find this most challenging in particular supply chains?
Well, I think every commodity has their own specialties and their own challenges. If you look just as an example at cattle, the production period, how it's called, it's usually a 24-month period from the date of birth until the slaughter date, and then you need to collect all the geolocation data on which that cattle was grazing. And on the other hand, it's also possible that cattle has been fed with soy, and so that brings another complexity with another commodity that's impacted by the EUDR. So every commodity has their challenges, and if you look at cattle, it's not just the meat out of it, it's also the leather, obviously, and that's an industry where traceability hasn't been that big part of the supply chain so far. So just as one example.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. We often think about forests as there are certain companies or certain commodities you might associate with forests, but you mentioned leather, so then we're talking about car companies and not the kind of companies you'd normally think about having to worry about forests and deforestation. So what about the data that's needed to report on this? There's this new EU Earth Observatory that's coming out with deforestation data. There's a wealth of open data out there. Is the data available to be able to respond to this?
Well, the European Union has published the Forest Observatory in, I think, around Christmas last year, and that's basically a global map on where it's a preliminary map. They will reassess that, where they believe there was primary forest, with the key date in the EUDR is the 31st December 2020. So every deforestation after that is basically not allowed to be or for forest degradation being imported into the European Union. That is a good first starting point, having that forest observatory map, but in the most cases it's not enough, because the EUDR brings a lot of challenges. If you talk again about smallholders, if you are below 4 acres, just the geolocation point is enough, and that then depends on how do you assess that and how do you draw the radius around that. So that means that you need to dig a little bit further, and for that you have the US satellite program where you have data going 40 years back. We have the European one where the data is going 10 years back. And that's usually our baseline with which we can catch around 95% of the cases. And if you then look at edge cases, it is possible that you need to go into further high resolution data, especially when it comes to conversions that are allowed within the legislation. Because if you do infrastructure projects, so someone extending a building on a property, that's basically an allowed conversion within the context of the legislation. And catching those edge cases is definitely challenging, and there you need to train a lot of data, and also AI plays a crucial role in that, obviously. Yeah.
Just as a heads up, I could happily speak with Matthias all afternoon, but I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm going to check if there are any in the audience. So if you have a question, get ready. So Matthias, one more thing I wanted to ask about was there's obviously a lot of legislation that already touches in this place, and there's even more legislation that's coming in the sustainability place, particularly in Europe. Could you talk a little bit about how the EUDR fits with existing and incoming regulation?
Yeah. I think most of the legislations that we have in terms of ESG regulations tackle one particular point, and that's about gaining transparency of your own company, gaining transparency on your products, and gaining transparency on your supply chain. And there's a lot of different legislations out there. If you look at supply chain transparency as an example, we have a legislation in Germany, we have another one in France, to name just some examples. And they have all in common getting transparency on that supply chain. And that's exactly also what the EUDR is doing, the deforestation-free regulation. So they have a lot of things in common, also talking about the raw material act, and it has all in common that we need to gain that transparency, and that also the reporting is in a lot of cases combined into one regulation. That's also the case within EUDR, where the yearly report will be incorporated into the corporate sustainability reporting directive, so that there's one single place of reporting. So there's a lot of synergies in all of those legislations.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? I can see two, one at the back, one here.
Thank you. Hello. How can EUDR be used to involve not only the companies, but also their investors in stopping deforestation?
Well, I think that's an important question, and I think it goes down to what I just said. It's having a look at the... so first of all, I think the investors also are looking more into gaining those visibilities on how you are sourcing products and how you are producing them, because there's a huge interest in gaining transparency and having a view if those supply chains are deforestation free, and incorporating that within, for example, your sustainability reporting, which you also, as non-financial reporting, make transparent to your investors, is, in my view, very crucial part. So that's also coming down to incorporating that into the CSRD report as one example.
And I think it's true, isn't it, that although financial institutions are exempt initially, that there's a strong expectation they will be brought in the years coming.
Definitely, yeah. It's just the beginning at the end. So they are talking already about extending the scope, extending the exposure of it. So it's the beginning.
Thank you. We should have time for one more question just here, and the lady in the black. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's not a question, it's actually a comment. I work for an organization called Prefer by Nature. We're also supporting actors to be EUDR compliant, both a different part of the supply chain, both at the producing site and the operators, the buyers. So we know that this regulation is going to be mandatory for operators by December 2024. And what we're seeing with our partners and clients is that at both ends, they are shaking, right? Operators want to make sure that they have the right supplies that complies with the regulation. And then the producers, they want to make sure that they will be able to supply to their buyers. So one advice that we're providing to our partners is to engage dialogue between the two of you. So there's transparency, there is risk mitigation at least done at the very early stage. That was just a comment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's a good comment because it's really the time is running out, right? We have December left until December, and there's a lot of engagement happen if you have a complex supply chain. So software is just one part of it, but the engagement is at the moment the biggest part upstream in the supply chain.
And talking of time running out, unfortunately, we've hit the end of ours. So thank you very much, and thanks very much to Matthias.
Thank you.